Welcome to the last section of the course, where we're going to wrap up the entire Intro to Computer Science Programming with Java series by going over several different methods for creating software. We're going to start in this lesson with discussing the software development process. Now, the software development process is also referred to as the software lifecycle, which includes from beginning to end all of the tasks that are completed while developing your application. These tasks can be broken down into multiple different development phases. We have planning and analysis, design, implementation, testing, documentation, and then deployment. In the planning and analysis phase, you'll compile all of the needed functionality and requirements of the application that you're building into a file that you can use as a requirements document. This will help you to identify what your program needs and allows you to refer back to the needed functionality later on in the software lifecycle. Next, we move into the design phase, which is where you'll start coming up with how you're going to implement the functionality and requirements that you came up with from the previous planning and analysis phase. So you'll want to plan out classes and the relationships between those classes, like inheritance and interfaces, as well as the needed methods that'll be utilized in your application. Next is the implementation phase, which is where you'll actually begin to code and write your application to meet the requirements that were set in the first phase and to create the classes, relationships, and methods that you defined in the design phase. Then we move on to the testing phase. This is where you'll write and conduct tests to ensure that your program is working as expected. You may even hire testers to use your program and document what they experience and then write a report based on your testing results. Now, many developers use TDD, which is test-driven development, so this testing phase a lot of the time is integrated into the implementation phase. Next comes the documentation phase. Usually some type of documentation is created during the development of the application. So some developers create a lot of documentation and others not so much, depending on the development methodology that they're following. But having some type of documentation is important for maintaining and extending your application. And then lastly, we have the deployment phase, which is when you'll launch your program and make it available for use. Your customers or client will then install and begin using the final program. Now, shortly after launching your application, this will lead into having to perform maintenance to keep the application healthy. Now, I mentioned a term called the development methodology in the documentation phase, and this is sometimes referred to as the development model. So all of the phases that I just listed can be modified and used as needed, depending on how you like to approach your software development. There are many different development models out there that you can follow to make this process as efficient as possible, and they all have benefits and disadvantages. So you'll need to evaluate which one best suits your needs, or you can even pick and choose from multiple models and come up with your own solution. One of the first models that you'll likely encounter is the waterfall model, which uses pretty much the same phases that I just described to you. There's a requirements phase, the design phase, an implementation phase, the testing phase, and finally deployment and maintenance. With the waterfall model, you follow this outline of phases pretty strictly, doing one phase after the other in a linear fashion, and you don't revert back to previous phases once you've proceeded forward. The problem with this model is that once you get into the implementation or testing phases, you'll likely realize that your requirements and functionality need to be changed, or you could perhaps have created the application in a better way. But with the waterfall model, you don't go back to previous phases. That requirements and design phase is now complete. It's over with, and you have to stick with what you have. So at the end of the whole process, you end up with a product that you and/or your client aren't very happy with. So we can see that the shortcomings with the waterfall model is that we can't go back to previous phases, and we can't give that phase another iteration to make changes to our requirements or to modify how we plan to tackle the design of the application. We need to be able to go back to a previous phase. So that's where we could use a new model, like the spiral model. The spiral model, which can be kind of complex, but to make it as simple as possible, it allows the developers of the application to work in iterations and to create prototypes of how the application should work. The prototype doesn't have to have all of the bells and whistles of the complete program, but it does allow the client or users of the application to begin testing and working with the prototypes, providing instant feedback. The developers can then take that feedback and do another iteration, kind of like a spiral of iterations, to improve upon the application. Now, there is a downside with the spiral model, which is that with all of these iterations, they may never end. You could essentially keep running into more and more changes and keep doing another iteration, increasing the development time. So you have to know when to call it quits and to be happy with what you have in order to ship out the application on time. Now, there are other models out there, like Agile Development, which focuses on iterations and doing development in increments, similar to the spiral model. But rather than all of the attention being placed on a formal development process that you follow, Agile is more about sticking with some very adaptable best practices to increase the flexibility of the development lifecycle. And it puts emphasis on collaboration, like paired programming. But I believe I've given you enough information about development models that you should be able to mix and match to come up with your own process, or to where you should be able to do a little more research to find which model best suits your needs. Next up, we'll go over some tips that you can use for creating your own classes during the design phase of building an application. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next lesson.